So back in November 2019, I released Doc Shock, an attempt to take a look at documentary cinema. I mentioned previously that documentary has always kind of been a bit of a blind spot for me in terms of my technical film knowledge. I can break down any work of fiction, fine, no problem. But analysing documentary cinema? Completely different kettle of fish, and one I'm not entirely well prepared for. So, I used Doc Shock as a way to kind of give an airing to a load of documentaries I've enjoyed watching in less of a let's break it down and see how it ticks kind of way, and more of a I really enjoyed these and I think you might really dig them too kind of way. So, without further ado, let's Doc Shock 2. Right from the off, I want to get the absolute bleakest documentary in this video off my list. Most people would cite movies like Cannibal Holocaust or Threads as examples of bleak documentary-style cinema. But with 1981's The Silent Minority, the thing that really takes this to the next level is that what you're actually seeing on screen really happened. And it needs bearing in mind that what was presented on screen in this documentary not only would have been the TV-friendly telling of events, but that what's shown, and worse, would have probably been the norm in the UK's mental health services up to that point. And this is the only film on the list that I feel I need to put a trigger warning in, because if you do choose to seek out this documentary, you really need to be aware that you are going to see some serious abuse of people with various physical and mental disabilities. The film aired in 1981 on ITV in the ATV region of the UK, and documents the living conditions of the residents in Boroughcourt Hospital in Reading and St Lawrence Hospital in Surrey, and is of particular note because it documents some of the last active psychiatric asylums, Bedlam in essence, in the country right before they were closed and mental health services in the UK were transitioned towards the currently failed care in the community model. Throughout the documentary, we see squalid living conditions, buildings literally falling apart and not fit for purpose. We get to see interviews with some of the staff who maintain the hospital and the residents, and we get to hear from several patients, all in various states of distress, as were effectively shown in absolute unflinching detail the total and utter failings of a system designed to sweep living, breathing people under the rug and out of eyesight. There are several sequences showing residents being tied up, forcefully restrained, left outside in almost no clothing in extreme conditions, and at one point, and probably one of the more harrowing sequences in the documentary, a resident is tied to a pole and left to bang their head against it until they knock themselves unconscious. The whole documentary paints a system that was on the verge of absolute collapse, with a mixture of staff who were there trying genuinely to make these people's lives better, having to deal with red tape, and staff members who took the job because they were active sadists. On the release of the film, British health officials and members of Parliament protested the documentary as being inaccurate or not representative of healthcare countrywide. Please also bear in mind that it was a Thatcher-led Conservative government calling bullshit on this film, and I think you'll agree that this was less of a case of trying to get an accurate representation of the mental health services in the UK out to the public, and more of an arse-covering exercise because they didn't give a shit about people with disabilities. The documentary maker Nigel Evans admitted at the time to misleading hospital administrators in order to gain access to the hospitals for filming, and this was widely used as a stick to beat the filmmaker with on the documentary's accuracy. But honestly, I defy anyone to sit through this documentary and come out the other side thinking that what was captured here was faked. If you really want to know how bad conditions were in these hospitals, Evans captured 6 full reels of material for this documentary that had to be destroyed because the family members of the patients captured in the footage refused to give permission for it to be broadcast as the footage was, quote, too distressing. Genuinely one of the most harrowing and powerful documentaries I've ever seen. I struggled and winced through it twice and would struggle to give it a third watch. This documentary hits a little too close to home for me as someone with experience of the current hollowed out mental health systems of the UK. This needs to be seen by more people, but maybe make sure you've got your head in the right space because it is a difficult watch. Whenever I bring up documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis, I usually get one of 2 responses, either utter bewilderment and confusion or absolute adulation. There's no in between. But having spent the last few years slowly catching up on his back catalogue, if you like long-form, super in-depth discussions about the history of society, politics, culture, and how we've ended up where we are on both a countrywide and global level, Adam Curtis has got you covered. Initially, he started relatively small scale, covering the impacts of government policies on things like the environment or housing. But in more recent years, he's shifted his focus to instead take incredibly detailed looks at political systems in the UK, US, Russia, China, and other parts of the world. And in turn, he analyses their history, how they got where they are, and what the future may hold if they continue down the paths that they've been building. His groundbreaking short-run TV docuseries The Power of Nightmares was brought to my attention by Charlie Brooker around the mid-2000s. And since then, every time I hear his name attached to a project, I make it my mission to watch it as soon as possible. I could be mean here and recommend one of his earlier works, such as his 50-minute long documentary about how the UK government's use of cheap materials and cost-cutting on house and flat building could lead to unfathomable disasters and serious risks of building collapses and fires. That documentary was made in 1984, and they're still dealing with the fallout of the Grenfell Tower fire 5 years after it burnt to the ground due to cost-cutting and cheap materials being used in its construction. But instead, as an entry-level and still wonderfully relevant look at his style and work, I'm going to recommend 2016's Hypernormalisation, a near 3-hour-long documentary that looks to try and explain how the governments of the world, in tandem with media outlets, seek to create a constant sense of fear and uncertainty with the population to avoid proper scrutiny and by extension retain a near permanent grip on power. The idea being that people become so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information being presented to them on a daily basis that they effectively enter a state of paralysis where all they can really do is talk about how things can't stay this way before saying what's to be done, shrugging and getting on with their day. The film opens in New York in the 1970s and explains the frankly astounding situation where several banks clubbed together and bought New York City after the president refused to bail the city out during a financial collapse. It goes on to explain how the residents of New York at that time entered a period of desolate hopelessness, where life carried on as close to normal as possible while all around them buildings were literally collapsing, crime skyrocketed and people literally died in the streets. It shows how Donald Trump used this uncertainty and dilapidation of the city to purchase large swathes of real estate and grow a small empire. The fallout that all this had for the US on a wider scale, and while showing this, it also explains how life in the Soviet Union led to the election of Vladimir Putin, how Putin's media strategist developed the concept of hypernormalization by using tricks he developed while working as an experimental media and theatre producer, and how those techniques have now been adopted by governments the world over to keep people constantly tired, constantly uncertain, and in a state of just carrying on with a hearty helping of helpless desolation, and that we're all just heading towards a nothingness that we feel we have no power to control or change. It's a bit bleak. But knowing is half the battle, ladies and gents, and if you want a very quick crash course on how to effectively combat media bias, how to spot when your government is attempting to put you in a state of hypernormalization, and how to let go of that fleeting sense of discomfort every time you open a newspaper or turn the news on, Hypernormalisation is an absolute must-watch. If more people had seen this documentary, I really truly feel that a lot of the last 5 to 8 years would have played out very differently. And if you've already seen this documentary, or think nearly 3 hours on this subject isn't nearly enough time to get a full understanding of the situation, Mr. Curtis released a new 6-hour documentary in 2021 called Can't Get You Out of My Head, which covers all of the above, updating it to 2020, and he also has time to throw in the history of protest in the UK, US, Russia and China, the history on the war on drugs, the war on terror, Operation Mindfuck, the MKUltra experiment, individualism, and how modern terrorist organisations began and became radicalised. I consider it a masterpiece, but I do realise it may be a bit long for some. But yeah, Hypernormalisation. Check it out. Okay, so the first two of my picks on this were a little on the bleak and unpleasant side. This isn't entirely better, but it's at least a bit lighter. Sort of. I Think We're Alone Now is a 2008 documentary that takes a deep dive into the world of parasocial relationships, stalking, mental illness, hyperfixation, and fandoms. Throughout the documentary, we follow Jeff and Kelly, two of the biggest, self-proclaimed Tiffany fans. Tiffany, for those not in the know, was a 1980s pop artist who had successful hits with songs like the titular I Think We're Alone Now and All This Time. A bit of a one-hit wonder, she was mainly known for appearances in malls and her near-constant tour schedules. While Tiffany does turn up in the film a couple of times, the main spotlight is firmly on Jeff and Kelly, both of whom genuinely and sincerely believe that they have some kind of relationship or deep spiritual connection with the singer. Jeff, for example, suffers from some mental health issues and has a border-terrifying ability to spin any and all situations involving Tiffany into proof that she loves him and wants to protect him. He effortlessly shrugs off restraining orders, claims Tiffany's security guards are set on him to protect him, and has regularly been told in no uncertain terms to stay the hell away from her, something that Jeff refuses point blank to do. Kelly, by contrast, has an almost superhero-level origin story for her hyperfixation. They got into a motorbike accident and ended up in a coma. When they finally came around, they were convinced that it was Tiffany who had saved them from dying in the accident and guided them on the road to recovery. As a result, they've developed a bit of a complex and are convinced that they're intended to be together. What I particularly love about this documentary is how hands-off the filmmaker Sean Donnelly is around his subjects. He'll literally just hit record, keep a reasonable distance and let them go and go and go and go, and by doing that he easily pulls some of the most amazing moments out of these people that in the hands of a more controlling or prominent documentarian probably would have been missed or overlooked. It's little moments like Jeff's story of delivering a ceremonial Japanese sword and some chrysanthemums to Tiffany and it resulting in the LAPD arresting him on suspicion of sending a death threat, or Kelly's various somewhat off-ease moments of waxing about just how amazing Tiffany is as a being that really ultimately won me over. There is, in fact, as far as I can see, only one manufactured moment in this entire film, which is towards the end of the film when Sean manages to organise a get-together for Jeff and Kelly in the same location for a prolonged chat. I won't spoil here what happens as a result of that meeting, but needless to say, while it may be one of the few planned moments in the film, the conversation they have is entirely natural and I'm really glad he decided to get them together, as it makes the documentary worth the price of admission alone. Oddball, thought-provoking and bordering on the uncomfortable at several points, I Think We're Alone Now dances the line between entertainment and tragedy to create something that really calls into question the relationship between an artist and their supporters. I really enjoyed this, and I think it would pair really well with something like The Devil and Daniel Johnston in terms of narratives around outsiders and underdogs. Definitely worth a look in. 2013's That's Sexploitation really properly caught me off guard when I picked it up. With it being directed by exploitation cinema's own Frank Henenlotter, I was under the impression I was probably picking up something that would resemble 30% information about the sexploitation subgenre married to 70% hardcore porn. But I came away genuinely surprised, as the film itself is much more nuanced than that. The documentary is a lot softer than I expected and covers the history of sex in cinema from its earliest inceptions in What the Butler Saw machines at fairgrounds, right the way through to the abolition of the Hays Code in 1968. I mean, it does very briefly tiptoe into hardcore territory at the very, very end of the documentary to explain what happened post-1970, but otherwise, this is just a terrifically fascinating look at how filmmakers managed to avoid being censored or shut down by the Hays Code, and the lengths that patrons would go to in order to see sexual content from the 1920s and 30s right the way through to the 60s. With Henenlotter and David F. Friedman, here in his last on-screen appearance, narrating and visually hosting throughout, this film covers everything from the history of nudist holiday films to how filmmakers would use sexual health, pregnancy and hygiene as ways to get around the Hays Code and show full frontal nudity, burlesque, and even the advent of roughy films. No stone's left unturned, and if you're looking for a good entry-level documentary on the history of sex as a form of media, this documentary more than covers the key beats. What really helps this documentary take things to the next level and make it truly special is Henenlotter's relationship with the now sadly departed Mike Vraney. Vraney was the founder of Something Weird Video, and basically, the man was an archiving machine. He had warehouses full of vintage films that he'd rescued in any and all conditions from some of the weirdest and wildest places you can think of. And this documentary is almost entirely constructed using resources that he had painstakingly scoured the country to preserve. The documentary itself is a must-see in my opinion, but what really kicks things up to the next level here are the extra features on the Severin Films release of this. Included in the set are over 3.5 hours of shorts, loops, fragments and more, all centred around the titular subject. Ranging from the late 20s through to the late 60s, all in HD, all sourced from the Something Weird archives. It's miraculous any of this survives given how most media until the 1980s was considered disposable and sexually explicit content even more so than anything else. But here, a more than decent chunk of it is preserved for your smutty and border campy enjoyment. I had a real blast with that Sexploitation, an insightful look into the mindset of the censors and the men and women who tried their damnedest to subvert them. It's a more than decent watch for anyone with even a passing interest in censorship or the history of pornography. One I can highly recommend. When it comes to British eccentricity, most people will cite Tom Baker or Brian Blessed as examples of British eccentricity at its most prominent. But there's one chap who, depending where in the world or even in the UK you live, has near constantly missed the praise he so desperately deserves both as a musician, comedian and pioneer. That man is Chris Seavey, aka Frank Sidebottom. This is a hell of a papier-mâché hornet's nest I'm about to bust open in trying to explain this, but what the hell. So, Chris Seavey was a very eccentric chap who helmed the band The Freshies. They were a punkish-sounding group who were predominantly based in Manchester. During the latter days of the band's existence, Chris devised a mascot for them in the form of Frank Sidebottom, a 30-something man-child with a massive papier-mâché head who claimed to be the Freshies' biggest fan. As time went by, Frank would move from being a doodle into an actual being played by Chris. He'd appear at the start of the show to introduce the band, and slowly his role would become more and more prominent until Frank took up most of the show, with the Freshies kind of acting as an afterthought. Eventually the band would split, but Chris would carry on as Frank, performing ever-increasingly intricate stage shows that would more often than not spiral into bizarre monologues based around Frank's mundane life. Entire routines would centre around him needing to end the show early because he had to go shopping for his mum. He'd spend large chunks of the gig messing with the backing band's equipment to take the piss. He'd talk in depth about Doctor Who, Thunderbirds and Star Wars, but get more and more off topic until even he didn't really know what he was talking about anymore. In one particularly infamous incident, he was made aware that Gary Glitter was performing a show right after Frank's that evening, so Frank set off all of Glitter's pyrotechnics for a laugh. Chris utilised his musical abilities and made Frank a wannabe pop rock star, performing cover versions of famous rock and pop songs like Born in the USA, Anarchy in the UK and Last Train to Clarksville, but changing all the lyrics to make them incredibly inane and largely based around things Frank had done that week, or about his favourite place in the whole wide world, his hometown of Timperley, Manchester. I was lucky enough to see Frank live in 2009 in a triple bill with fellow artists and comedians John Cooper Clarke and Charlie Chuck, and I can confirm it was one of the most anarchic nights of entertainment that I've ever sat through. Frank was someone you simultaneously really wanted to go up and talk to, whilst also being absolutely terrified of where that conversation might go. Frank's true identity was a quite badly kept secret. Anyone who knew even a vague history of Frank or the Freshies knew that it was Chris under the papier-mâché head, but no one had any photographic evidence of Chris Seavey in the public domain. It was literally like he disappeared off the face of the earth almost entirely at some point in the early 80s, which made it all the more heartbreaking when completely out of the blue it was announced in June 2010 that Chris had died after a very short battle with cancer. An outpouring from the world of music, film and comedy soon followed as people from across the cultural spectrum all came together to share stories of Chris, Frank and the wonderfully weird world that he'd created. A couple of years after his death, filmmaker Steve Sullivan, with the blessing of the Seavey estate, began efforts to produce a documentary that would aim not only to chart the history of Frank, but to really spotlight Chris Seavey, who, contrary to popular belief, hadn't dropped off the face of the earth in the mid-80s. And in fact had led an even more colourful and bizarre life in private than Frank had in public. The combined efforts of fans of Frank, Kickstarter supporters, celebrities and the Seavey estate ended up producing Being Frank, a documentary some 6 years almost in the making. And honestly, it's probably the most comprehensive look at both Frank and Chris that has ever existed. Filled to the brim with excerpts from Chris's own personal archive, the man logged and saved pretty much everything, and various archives across film and television, this fast-paced and incredibly insightful film really lifts the lid on Seavey's personal demons, his love-hate relationship with Frank as a character, and all the shades in between. The Blu-ray release comes packed with bonus features, including Frank's short films, music videos, TV appearances, and much, much more. It's just an amazing collection for any budding Frank fan. If you've been feeling like life's a bit grey since the pandemic hit and you're looking to give yourself a colourful little boost, a way to say, well, this weirdness existed, maybe life isn't so bad. Being Frank will almost certainly help turn even the most ardent frown upside down. Go grab it if you can, and introduce yourself to the wonderfully silly, weird world of Frank Sidebottom. Well, there's 5 of the best. I hope you consider checking some of these out, as I had a blast with them. Normal service resumes next week, so till next time.